Daniel awoke with the start to music. The tone of the music was gentle, but it seemed blaringly loud in his ears. He thought to himself that he hadn't heard music in a while, and he didn't recognize this tune. He couldn't remember falling asleep, but it must have been late. The room was pitch black. However, just seconds after he opened his eyes, harsh lights flickered on and glared at him from a stark ceiling. He blinked rapidly, struggling to keep his eyes open. He didn't recognize his surroundings either. Nervous tension rose in his chest, tying a knot in his airway. He didn't even remember falling asleep. He began to sit up, though his body ached and protested as if chained to heavy weights. He was in a small, dull room with no apparent windows and a very strange interior design. The walls seemed to be made of panels of some sort of semi-glossy plastic, and in addition to the lights on the ceiling, several of these panels glowed gently. His aching body pulled him back down to the bed, where he lay on the pillow trying to think. Had he gone out drinking last night? Was he drugged? Was he captive somewhere? Traveling, maybe? The last thing he remembered was... the memories were foggy. He had been at work. Somehow he knew that much. A fear wound up inside him. "Hello?" he said aloud, his dry throat rasping. He tried to swallow, and pain followed all the way down his esophagus. What little saliva he had to work with caught in his throat, and he choked, coughing pitifully. He tried again, slower this time. There was panic in his voice when he spoke. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Then a voice answered him, startling him. He jumped and looked frantically around the room. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere in the room, but no one was there. "Good morning, Dan." The voice sounded excited and eerily familiar. It spoke in a gentle but energetic London accent. Daniel was unsure what to say. He had too many questions, and his brain was too fogged to think clearly. After a moment's hesitation, the voice continued. "How are you feeling, buddy? Doing okay, I hope." Daniel attempted again to speak. "I feel awful. Where am I?" The voice cleared his throat. "Dude, you made it. It's time to celebrate. Years of hard work and stress are finally paying off. But more on that later. You're probably feeling very sore and stiff. Your mind is probably having the worst hangover of its life." Daniel nodded. He found that the familiarity of the voice was helping him to calm down. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Don't worry, these things are normal. You can relax. You're safe. In fact, the worst is behind you. I bet right now you're trying to figure out where you are and what happened. Believe me, try to relax. It will all come back to you." Daniel was beginning to get the idea that what he was hearing must be a recording. It made no attempt to respond to him. Then it hit him, why the voice sounds so familiar. The realization came crashing in on him. It was his own voice he was hearing. "You're me," Daniel said without much thought. After a fairly long pause, the recording plugged onwards without answering his question. But Daniel grew more certain by the second. "Let me tell you a little story to help you out. Your name is Daniel King. You're an astronaut and scientist for Nebula Corporation. You were chosen to participate in Phase 5 of the Artemis project. You were placed into hypersleep, a sort of deep coma that causes your body's processes to slow down significantly. Don't freak out, but what you sense as this morning was actually about 2 years ago. But the good news is you're up and going now. Your mission is to go to and study the Earth-like planet lovingly named Apollo, and to investigate all life and circumstances there. If you weren't me, I'd be jealous. You were in for one wild ride. Aliens, bro. You're going to see an actual alien life in a matter of days. Memory should come pretty quick as you wake up. I'd recommend getting up and doing some paces through the ship. Test out that gravity, get the blood flowing." Daniel sat up and then slowly stood up, happy to see that despite its stiffness and fatigue, his body did seem to be functioning fully. The fog in his brain was starting to dissipate. As he listened to the recording of his own voice, he could remember making it, and the words began to come to him even as he heard them spoken by the recording. The experience was like deja vu times 20, as all his memories fell back into place. His head spun and he sat back down on the bed. This was no strange room. He had been here 100 times. He had worked here, studied here, gone to sleep here. He knew that it had been nearly 2 years, but now that he remembered it, it felt like seconds, minutes at most. His recorded voice kept speaking. Now I know you're excited, but in case your memory is taking longer than expected to return, let's review a couple of things. You have 3 other colleagues on the ship with you, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Natalia. They may be awake already, if not, they'll be up soon. Do not attempt to accelerate the process in any manner. Due to the repercussions of hypersleep and the unpredictability of this new environment, you will be introduced to things slowly. You memorize this protocol like your own name back on Earth. Hopefully it will return soon. After 2 hours, you will be allowed to leave your room. This is to ensure you reach a state where you are fully conscious and physically strong enough to move around. Food and drink can be found in the main room right outside the one you're in. The recording kept droning on with information about the ship, protocol to follow after waking up. But Daniel was remembering it all now. He started to feel the excitement he knew he had been feeling when he made the recording. It took him several minutes to make the attempt to stand up again. He began to look around the room more closely. A once dark panel had lit up with a display, and now it displayed the time, which said 2:13:42. If his memory served him, that meant it was the 13th hour of their 3rd day on the planet. No surprise there, waking up from hypersleep was a delicate process. His colleagues could be awake or they might not. Each of them had gone through the hypersleep process in order to test their body's reaction to prepare for the actual procedure. If you remember correctly, he had woken up a second, just an hour or two after the target time. But that had been for only 5 days, and according to scientists back home, hypersleep deepened over time. It's sort of like anesthesia. Through careful calculations and with years of training, the anesthesiologist doses a patient according to the length of the surgery, but there is always a margin of error. Every patient's body reacts a little differently. Put a patient to sleep for 5 hours, it may end up as 5.5 or 4.5. Putting someone into hypersleep for 2 years with only a couple days margin is a victory worth celebrating. Next to the time was the information about the ship, the inside temperature, and the outside temperature. The inside temp was a cool 65 degrees Fahrenheit, probably slowly warming as part of the waking process. Daniel was very interested in the outside temp. It read 40 degrees, sort of cold, but very manageable. To the right of this panel, attached to the wall, was a small desk. He could see the small slit where the screen emerged, like the tray in an old DVD player. He pressed the button and the screen rolled up silently. Then he turned to the long, horizontal panel above the desk. Excitement and anticipation filled him. There was a slight depression at the bottom of the panel, and he put his finger on it. He took a deep breath, knowing very well that he may be the first human in history to gaze upon this planet with their own eyes. He had seen probe photos, of course, but could they really do it justice? He pushed on the panel and it gave slightly, released, and then slipped upwards. It was dark outside, and he could see his reflection brightly in the thick glass, but beyond he could see vague shapes. He almost ran to the light switch, forgetting completely that his body hadn't moved that quickly in nearly 800 days. He stumbled clumsily, but managed to catch himself on the opposite wall. The small quarters were only 8 feet across. He dimmed the lights to their lowest setting and shuffled back to the window. Then he planted his face against the glass and cupped his hands around his eyes. His breath caught. He was gazing out upon a lush tropical forest, bathed in soft bluish moonlight. In the darkness, he almost could have convinced himself he was on some earthly forest, perhaps in a place he had never been. But as he took in every detail, the differences became clear. Though they were difficult to distinguish in the moonlight, he could see that many of the leaves were not green. He remembered from pictures that while some plants seen on Apollo were green, many were also red, yellow, purplish, and even bluish. Such plants existed on Earth, but they seemed to be abundant here. The plants also grew in different patterns. What looked like a thick tree was actually a tight bundle of individual stems. These stems swayed dramatically in the slight breeze. He could see no animals, but he knew that such a lush ecosystem couldn't exist without them, and he couldn't wait to find them. He was still finding it difficult to believe that he was looking at a different planet in a different solar system with a completely different evolutionary history. Daniel had spent years around astronauts and space travelers. He had talked to people that had been to Mars, to the Moon, even people who had visited giant asteroids. He was all too familiar with bulky spacesuits, time-consuming airlocks, the constant fear of a single leak or break. It was almost unfathomable to him that when he finally got the chance to step outside the spacecraft, he would be wearing little more than the clothes on his back and a breathing mask. From what he remembered, that moment would come in about 24 hours from waking, after everything in the body had truly woken up and returned to normal. Suddenly something popped into his mind, and he remembered that he could see ship information, including crew status, on the screen. He pulled himself away from the window and over to the screen. He double-tapped on the ship information window and it enlarged. He could see a little map of the ship with various stats and statuses available for each part. Most of the ship was never intended to be used until it arrived on the planet, so it was laid out more like a small apartment than a traditional spaceship. A very small apartment with a large laboratory in the middle. The 4 small crew quarters were on the outside of the ship. A small orange dot was in each rectangular room. 2 of the 4 were in the top edge of the room where the bed was. The 3rd dot in the lower left room, which Daniel recognized as his own, was at the lower edge of the room. That meant the other crew members were either still coming out of hypersleep or had woken up long enough to go to be sleeping again already. It was possible, but seemed unlikely. Daniel remembered after waking up from his previous 5-day stint in hypersleep that he didn't feel the need to sleep again for at least 24 hours. The 4th bedroom was empty. No dot glowed in its outline. He also noticed the status readout for bedroom 4 was blank. There were no other dots to be found on the ship. He wasn't sure what that meant. Had someone already passed their 24-hour hold and exited the ship? Even if that were the case, the ship should still read the room's life support and power status. It was concerning, but Daniel only dwelled on it briefly. Only time would bring answers. The aforementioned 2-hour period dragged on for an eternity. This was another known side effect of hypersleep. When 2 years feels like moments, 2 hours could all of a sudden feel like forever. But it was also a symptom of grand anticipation. He paced the room, did push-ups, and typed randomly on the computer's keyboard, trying to regain his strength and coordination. As his body adjusted and began working again, he began to feel hunger and thirst. The room felt like a prison. He leaned against the door, eyes closed, and thumped a fist lightly against it. "I'm pretty sure I'm ready," he said. "You can let me out." Of course, there was no response, but hearing the sound of his own voice was comforting. He wandered over to the other side of the room and sat down on the desk, dangling his legs over the side. The computer screen and keyboard had retracted below the desktop. He picked at his nails, which were slightly overgrown. After a moment, he stopped and chuckled to himself. "Guess 2 years wasn't long enough to break this habit, huh?" Finally, the door clicked and swung open. Daniel dropped down from the table and moved towards the exit. He looked around the central room of the ship. The average-sized room seemed spacious compared to the cramped bedroom. The room was divided into 2 halves. The front wall was covered in laboratory equipment and computers. The back half had a small kitchen-like area and a large table. The side walls were covered in cabinets and shelves for storage, and at the back was a large double door, not quite an airlock. The difference in pressure should be negligible, but enough to keep the ship's atmosphere inside and the planet's atmosphere out. As expected, the room was empty. The place looked undisturbed, no sign that any crew member had been out there, but there was no way to be sure. The first thing on Daniel's mind was food and water. His stomach growled. It took him a minute of scanning the cabinets and drawers to remember where the food was. The food for the first couple of days after waking was planned out and ready to eat. It was simple and bland, but Daniel knew that as long as something was edible, it tasted amazing after hypersleep. He located the cabinet and was opening it when he remembered about bedroom 4. He glanced over at it. Number 4 on the door was unlit. This was meant to indicate that the occupant was still in hypersleep, but if there was really something wrong with the system, that might keep the light from coming on. Daniel walked over to the door and knocked on it lightly. No response. He tried the handle, but it was locked. He tapped the panel to the left of the door and the screen came to life. At least that was working. He tried to unlock the door using the panel, and a warning displayed on the screen. Invalid. Crew member still in hypersleep. On the surface, that all added up. The number was dark, the door was locked, and the panel said the crew was still in hypersleep. But that didn't explain the blank status or the lack of a 4th dot on the map in his room.